Experimental animation began at the turn of the 20th century. It was fueled by artists attempting to reject classical representation. This impulse led to a rapid evolution of abstraction in painting and sculpture. Dada and Surrealist artists sought to overthrow the traditional constraints by exploring the spontaneous, the subconscious, and the irrational. During the 1920s, most of the films that people saw were mass-produced by Hollywood. They were wholesome and had family values. But at this time, in Germany, France, and Denmark, filmmakers began to embrace a more personal attitude toward filmmaking through the medium of animation. Their basic motivation was not inspired by commercial gain, but rather a more personal drive to create art. This was called pure cinema. A major contributor to the Cubist movement was Fernand Léger. He was described as a painter who linked industry to art. During the 1920s, Léger began to pursue film and produced his classic film, Ballet Mécanique. The film was created without a script, but this masterpiece demonstrates a desire to combine the energy of machine with the classical elegance of ballet. Some people say that the whole point is that there is no point. This was during the Dada movement, when artists were making fun of art by creating things that were against the pre-existing rules of art. Dada means nothing. It's avant-garde, which means being the first wave. It's being the first to push the boundaries. You can't choose to be avant-garde, though. It's a term that historians use to identify a time in art history. German Dadaist Hans Richter collaborated with Viking Engel to produce a large body of scroll drawings that depicted sequential transformations of geometric forms that he described as the music of orchestrated form. Richter's silent films from the late 1920s demonstrated a more surreal approach that combined animation with live-action footage. At the time, these shocking films challenged artistic conventions by exploring fantasy through the use of special effects, many of which are used in contemporary filmmaking in Ghost Before Breakfast. People and objects engage in unusual behavior, set in bizarre and often disturbing settings. Flying hats continually reappear in conjunction with surrealist live images of men's beards magically appearing and disappearing. Teacups filling up by themselves, men disappearing behind street signs, and objects moving in reverse. After World War I, German painter Walter Ruttmann became impatient with the static quality of his artwork and saw potential of film as a medium for abstraction, motion, and passage of time. In 1920, he founded his own film company in Munich and pioneered a series of playful animated films entitled Opus, all of which explored the interaction of geometric forms. American artist Emanuel Rutkiss became the leader of the Dada movement of the 1920s and 1930s after he established Dadaism in New York City with Marcia Duchamp and Francis Pasiba. He moved to Paris and became a portrait photographer for a wealthy avant-garde. By the early 1920s, he developed a reputation for his use of natural light and informal poses during a time when picturism was the prominent style of photography in Europe. Throughout the 1920s, Man Ray produced surrealist films that were created without a camera, such as Animuc Cinema and Liotti di Mur. He often described them as inventions of light, form, and movement. In the 1930s, Russian-born filmmaker Alexander Alexandrov invented the pin board, later named the pin screen, one of the most eccentric traditional animation techniques. This contraption consisted of thousands of closely spaced pins that were pushed and pulled into a preformed screen, using rollers to achieve a varying height effect. When subject to light, they cast shadows from the pinhole, producing a wide range of tones, creating dramatic textures resembling a mezzanine, wood carving, or etching. The extraordinary results of this process are known in such classic movies as Night on Bald Mountain. Revolutionary New Zealand animator Len Lee, who often referred to himself as an artist of the 21st century, pioneered the direct-on-film technique of cameraless animation by painting and scratching onto 35mm celluloid. His use of abstract metaphorical images are a product of his association with surrealism, futurism, constructionism, and his affinity for jazz. His 1929 film Tussivala took him over 2 years to complete because he had to hand draw each frame one at a time. He later went on to make the 1958 film Free Radicals, which he also did by hand. He had to draw in thousands of feet of film, going one frame at a time. The Canadian filmmaker Norman McLare has been described as the poet of animation. He also made several films on which he just drew onto the film and scratched it to make the animations. In 1941, he was invited to join the newly formed National Film Board of Canada after he made such films as Fiddle Dee Dee in 1947 and Begone Dull Care in 1949. Texas filmmaker Mary Ellen Booth studied painting at Yale for several years and went on to make some of the first music videos. She used ping pong balls, images, and egg beaters and photographed them frame by frame at various speeds and matched them up with music. In 1930, she created the film Rhythm and Light, which involved her shooting paper and cardboard models through mirrors and glass to achieve a music video effect. The leading innovator of experimental film, Oskar Fischinger, believed that visual music was the future of art. Oskar performed several film studies that created charcoal drawings of pure geometry, shapes, and lines, constructed from approximately 5,000 drawings, shapes, and demonstrated a desire to marry sound and images. He also experimented with images produced from a wax slicing machine and explored color film techniques, cardboard cutouts, liquid, and structure wire supports. His presence in Hollywood helped shape generations of West Coast artists, filmmakers, graphic designers, and musicians. European animator Jan Javakanskper took the 1960s by storm. His innovative works have helped to expand the traditional animation beyond the concepts of just Disney cartoons. His bizarre, often grotesque style arose controversy in his home country of Czechoslovakia. He loved rapid montages and extreme close-ups. This can be seen in his films Historia Naturalia. In the 1970s and 80s, artists began using computer technology. Ivan Sutherland created technology called Sketchpad, which let the artist draw directly onto the screen. This made it much easier to complete experimental animations. These people were all pioneers of their time, and they truly changed history. But experimental animation is not over. It's still taking place today.